what the world wants to do is say, my real self is my inner sense of myself. My body is just this meat machine that I use to get around and relate in the world. No, God wants us to know the good and pursue the good, not just with our intellect and our will, but with our whole self.
Welcome to the EDIFY podcast, where our guests share practical wisdom on living our faith in public. I'm Mary Fiorito. Thank you for joining us today. Our guest today on the EDIFY podcast is Father Philip Bochanski, who is the Executive Director of Courage International. Father, welcome.
Thanks very much.
It's a pleasure to have you with us today. Tell us a little bit about Courage International for our listeners who might not be familiar with your apostolate.
Courage is an apostolate that was founded in the Archdiocese of New York in late September 1980 by an oblate priest of St. Francis de Sales, Father John Harvey. Father Harvey was from my home archdiocese of Philadelphia and had spent a lot of time teaching about the Church's doctrine on homosexuality, as well as pastoral care to people who are experiencing same-sex attractions, particularly priests and religious brothers. So with a little chapter, maybe 6 or 7 people at that initial meeting, they developed the goals that all of our members strive for, to live chaste lives, to develop a life of prayer and dedication, to create an atmosphere where everyone can speak freely about their experiences, to build chaste friendships, and to give good example to others and lead them to experience the joy and the freedom that comes from chastity. So today there are about 200 Courage chapters in 20 countries around the world. And
is there still the Encourage portion of it that's for the family members or the parents?
Yes, indeed. So shortly after Courage started to spread to dioceses like Boston and Philadelphia, and the stories about Courage started to appear in the Catholic press, people, mostly parents whose sons and daughters identified as, in those days, gay and lesbian, today we would say LGBT, started to reach out to Father Harvey and say, listen, my loved one is in this situation. I want to stay true to the faith, but I also want to keep our family intact. So how do I love them and affirm what I can, but also help them to see what the Church teaches? So Father was taking a lot of time to counsel them by phone or by letter himself, and then thought, well, the best thing to do is to get them together in groups to support one another. So that started to happen around 1987, and by 1992, it was formalized into the part of our apostolate called Encourage. Today, we have Encourage chapters in every country where we have Courage chapters, and as well as online chapters in English and Spanish. And we have chapters specifically for spouses of people who are experiencing same-sex attractions, as well as siblings. Most of them have young children and want to keep their child's aunt or uncle in their lives, but also have concerns about how to explain what's going on to their children and raise them to understand God's plan for sexuality.
And does the group, or both of them, Encouraging Courage, operate anonymously? Are they confidential?
Well, it's certainly confidential. If a person wants to remain anonymous or just use their first name, they're certainly free to do that. Other of our members, both Courage and Encourage, give their testimony, talk about their own experience, whether internally for our annual conference, but also sometimes to priests and other people that we give continuing formation to. And some, as you know, have appeared in videos and even a film that our apostolate put together about almost 10 years ago now. Mm-hmm. And so we do ask our members to respect each other's confidentiality if they happen to be in the same parish or in the same circles, to maybe not raise questions about, oh, well, how do you know so-and-so? Right. And just to build that kind of community where people can feel free to talk about whatever they're feeling, whatever's going on in their lives, and to say things, perhaps, I think it's especially true of Encourage, to say things that perhaps other friends or even other family members wouldn't understand or support.
No, right. Well, that gives a lot of freedom then to the people that
Absolutely.
So what percentage would you guesstimate of those who are members of Courage would be publicly, as the parlance goes, out to their families, would publicly identify as a person with same-sex attractions?
That's hard to estimate.
But it's not everyone.
It's not everyone, no. And I think as we go along in time, it's a larger percentage. At the beginning, I think many of our members were not very open about this in their own lives or in the life of the family. Our Anchorage members sometimes say when their children come out of the closet, they go in, because they do get some pushback from people in their lives. But I'm glad to see that more and more people are able to share what courage means to them and what God's been doing in their lives. We certainly encourage and support people who want to be open about this with family and friends and their spiritual director or other spiritual mentors. But the church's advice, certainly from the U.S. bishops in 2006, a very important document that they put together, is that to just kind of introduce oneself from the perspective of sexual orientation is not really helpful. If a person kind of defines themselves just by one part of their experience, even a part as profound as sexuality, it kind of gives other people implicit permission to only see them through that lens and not to have to get to know them. And labels kill dialogue. They're very attractive and very tempting in an age where we're really not very good at communicating with one another. If you say, well, this is the important thing you need to know about me, and I'm not interested in going any further, I can kind of check the box that I've got you figured out and just move along. So we encourage our members, to when they're ready, if they are ready, to tell people in their lives that kind of can love them better knowing this part of their story, but there's no pressure on anyone to kind of make this a big public statement.
Right. And then, too, I suppose, immediately labeling oneself or labeling another would restrict that person from growing or changing at any point in their life. Yeah. And I know particularly with adolescents, they, girls can go through a tomboy phase, whereas that used to be, she's going through a tomboy phase. Now it's, this person is either LGBTQ or whatever, non-binary label you want to assign, and that's not malleable, and that person is going to stay in this particular, box or world forever. Whereas, it's interesting to me that what used to be seen as like phases, and even for people who don't change and don't come out of the phase, but it was seen as, let's not jump to conclusions initially.
Yeah, I mean, if any of us were locked into the hairstyle or the clothing style or the music that we listened to when we were 14 years old, it'd be a much different world. Right?
Yeah, there'd be a lot more polyester in the world for many people.
Indeed. And you're right that to think that, well, the way I feel now is the way I'm always going to feel.
Right.
It can get a person to stop kind of needing to grow or needing to understand themselves. One thing I've experienced with some of the young folks that I've worked with is the people who were very out in high school, and then when they went to college in another place, decided, well, I don't necessarily want all of my friendships to be centered around this aspect, but it's difficult once you've told everybody who's important to you that this is me, to then say, well, it's still something that I feel, but it's not something that necessarily is going to direct my life. There's a number of young adults that I've met who really their deep desire is to be parents, to be married to a person of the opposite sex, to be able to have children of their own, to have what sometimes they would describe as a quote unquote normal life. Right.
Is it possible to do a course correction, or I know that what is sometimes very derogatorily called conversion therapy is very much, it's illegal. In fact, I think in some places that you can even mention it as a therapist. But if it's not conversion, but simply a person's, human development and growth, is that something that you've seen? I mean, in the situation you've described, somebody who may have identified in high school as a particular way, in college doesn't feel that strongly about it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's certainly something that happens. I wouldn't say that it's the majority of people that I encounter through courage, and certainly not the majority of of people in the general population.
Right.
I would never advise. We certainly support our members who want to go to a reputable counselor, especially someone who has an understanding of the church's anthropology, what it means to be human, to talk about family dynamics and trauma or wounds, questions about identity and self, questions about relationships,
Anxiety issues,
depression, all those kind of
right.
things. But if one of our members or a friend would ask me, who do I go to kind of change my attractions or change my orientation, I would never advise someone to go with that singular goal in mind, right? I think it can often be helpful to understand ourselves better and to understand coping mechanisms and things like that. And sometimes as we understand ourselves and our relationships and our self-image and those kind of things better, we find, wow, I feel better. I'm not so kind of locked into this way of looking at myself or other people or this way of coping. And there is a freedom that can come from that to just understand the inspirations that come from God and the desires of one's own heart, and to take it step by step. It's in a way, it's like the advice that I give to young men in the parish who, I'll talk to them about a priestly vocation, and they get immediately very, very scared, and they don't want to say that it's ever even crossed their minds. And I'll say to them, well, you don't have to say yes right away. Just don't say no right away. And so, the church does not expect, much less demand, that any person, in order to be holy, to find their vocation, to be a saint, has to, quote unquote, become straight. In my experience, that's not as easy as flipping a switch or seeing a therapist or anything like that. What the church expects of each person is to understand what chastity means, fundamentally from the starting point of integration of sexuality and attractions and desires and behaviors into the bigger picture of who we are as sons and daughters of God, to live that out and then to respond to the direction and discernment that God gives us.
Well, then let's unpack this in terms of how the church approaches people who experience same-sex attractions. Is it a sin to be gay?
No.
And what does the church teach about the origins of people who might be experiencing these same-sex attractions?
So the church makes a distinction when she teaches on the subject between the person, an inclination or desire, and actions. So the person is always good, created in the image and likeness of God. Every single human being is created on purpose by God with the cooperation of our parents. He creates us as a union of body and soul, and our bodies have sexual identity as male or female. Our souls shape our bodies, and our bodies have an impact on our souls. So there's not male souls and female souls, but as we grow as body and soul. So our sexual identity shapes our personality, shapes our relationships, all the spiritual parts of us. So our vocation is certainly connected to our sexual identity. Our sexual identity is shaped by our spiritual life, the way we pray, the way we communicate with God, with others. There's really, what the world wants to do is say, my real self is my inner sense of myself. My body is just this meat machine that I use to get around and relate in the world. No, our bodies, our souls, they only exist with each other and for each other. So what the church asks of us to do in terms of our identity is to acknowledge and accept our sexual identity, as the Catechism says, right? So our vocation is shaped by it, our relationships are shaped by it, but it's always good. And so in terms of desires, the existence of desires as a spiritual reality, as well as a reality that has impact on the body and is affected by the body, in their origins, they're good because they're part of what it means to be human. And God wants us to know the good and pursue the good, not just with our intellect and our will, but with our whole self, body and soul, which means He wants us to desire the good and run toward it enthusiastically because we're attracted to it. He wants us to be repelled by evil, not just intellectually know we should avoid it, but to be disgusted by evil and back away from it, body and soul. And so sexual desires, desires to be in relationship, as well as all of our other emotions and appetites and desires. In their origin, they're good, and they're an important part of our lives. And you said, is being gay a sin? Well, in terms of the attraction that a person experiences, it's not evil in itself. It's to feel an attraction, and it's not something necessarily voluntary either. So it's not a sin to feel a feeling. Mm-hmm. We have to take responsibility for where we go and what situations we put ourselves in. What we used to say all the time, in the occasion of sin, the near occasion of sin. So we're responsible for whether we're putting ourselves in a situation to be tempted, but to have a feeling is not a sin in itself. Mm-hmm. Now that doesn't mean that every feeling that we feel is necessarily heading in the right direction, right? Because of the reality of the original sin, which distorts the relationship between us and God, between human beings, and especially the relationship between the body and the soul. Mm-hmm. St. Paul says this in the letter to the Romans. There's a battle inside me. The good that I can see with my intellect and even kind of want to do, I'm not attracted to that. I'm not drawn to that. Right. But on the other hand, the evil that I can see is evil, and I know I shouldn't do. I really want to do that, right? Mm-hmm. And everybody has disordered affections, attractions that are heading in the wrong direction, where the path or the order of our lives sets us in one direction, and our attractions take us somewhere else.
There was an article I read in All Places of the Huffington Post, which is hardly known for being a mouthpiece of the Catholic Church, written by a young man. I think he was in his late 20s, but he had, when he was about 14 or 15, gone to the library with his father and was looking in a certain section of the stack of books, and a man came up behind him and, as a lawyer, I would say sexually assaulted him, and this young man didn't know what was going on, but reacted physically to the actions of this particular man. What role does that kind of initial, sexual exposure at a particular point in puberty for both girls or boys, how does that shape the attractions, the same-sex attractions that people might feel?
So just kind of as a fundamental point, in the Catechism, the Church says that the genesis of same-sex attractions in the mind and heart of a person remains largely unexplained. So it's just, I think it's super important to just acknowledge that there's
not to assign blame.
Right, there's not a one-size-fits-all story.
Right.
Because for as many people as would write an article like the one that you're talking about, there will be others who will be very, very clear. I've never been abused. I've never experienced that kind of trauma. However, as I said a minute ago, our bodies and our souls have an impact on each other, right? And so, our bodies feel things when they're touched or when we're approached in an intimate or sexual way. Our minds see things and our bodies feel things when a person watches pornography or has a fantasy. And it can be extraordinarily confusing for a young person to kind of be caught in the middle of something like that, where he says, well, I know this is wrong, but it feels really good. Or I know that he shouldn't have done that to me, but why did my body respond to that?
Right.
And so it can be part of the story of people who experience same-sex attractions. It can be part of the story of people who are over-sexualized in the opposite sex direction, right? A young person who is in a traumatic for him at the even though he might not have recognized that at the moment, sexual encounter with a neighbor or a friend or a sibling or whatever, and then in an effort to kind of resolve those questions, is a womanizer and involved in the hookup culture and this and that. So I want to stay in my lane here. I'm not a psychologist, right?
Right. No, I understand,
but yeah. So there are all sorts of things, whether they be traumatic experiences like that or very early exposure to pornography. They say that the average age at which a boy sees pornography is somewhere between 8 and 9 years old, which is horrifying in every possible aspect. Whether it's relationships with parents or kind of comparing oneself to siblings, whether it's being very well received or on the other hand rejected by a teacher or a mentor, or or just issues about one's body, about whether one measures up. There's all these things that I've found in ministry can be part of a person's story. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't say any of them are something you can put your finger on and say, all right, this is in everybody's story, this is the reason that it happens, etc. There's just
too many variables.
Yeah, and this is why our starting point is always accompaniment. Mm-hmm. We accompany a person starting from his or her situation. Mm-hmm. Tell me your story, and then if we really listen to a person's story, and it's not always going to come out all at once, right? Because there are things that are more difficult to talk about. But to stick with someone, to give them a chance to tell their story from their own perspective. Mm-hmm. Then having listened to that, we have a better starting point from which to share the rest of the story. Right. This is who we are as human beings. This is what it means to be male or female. This is God's plan for our sexuality. This is, if we just start with that, and either try to tell someone they're on the wrong road or to tell someone you have to figure this out on your own, well, the conversation's over. But, if we're starting from, tell me what's going on, tell me how you feel, what are you looking for? Are you finding what you're looking for? Have you stopped looking for that? Mm-hmm. And help someone to kind of answer those questions for themselves. Probably not in front of us in that first conversation, but, to think about it, talk about it. It can really make a big difference in saying, I thought that my identity was coming from one place, but really I see myself more clearly because I understand how God is looking at me.
Mm-hmm. Well, you mentioned the first pornography experience for boys, or exposure rather, is between 8 and 9 years old. My husband for a time did internet security at a Catholic elementary school, and had every filter known to God and man on the computers, but he could see when there were hits on pornography sites because he would get a report. And he came home from work very troubled one day, and I said, what's wrong? He said, the 4th and 5th grade boys had a computer lab today. And he said there were hundreds of attempts to get onto different sites. And he said they weren't just randomly searching, like they knew the sites to go to. He said, which means there's probably not filters on their computers at home, or they have fathers or maybe even mothers who are looking. It was very troubling that boys that young would be, and some of them were very hardcore sites, unfortunately, and very frighteningly. So we're seeing now that this isn't an issue, certainly not pornography, but also because of the way the culture now is in our country, and I think around the world, that the LGBTQ movement and lobby and interest groups are present not just now in the adult sphere, but we have drag queens in libraries. We have LGBTQ Pride Month children's books in the library. You can't even go into a library in June and not be faced with one of these big displays. So in Catholic schools, where we want to, as you have so beautifully pointed out, help people to learn to tell their stories, help them to understand that they are all good and created by a good and loving God who has a purpose for their life. How would you suggest that Catholic sexual education, we used to call it Becoming a Person back in the 80s and the 70s when we had those books, and, Sister would teach you, but those classes where we are trying to talk to kids about human sexuality, it seems to me need to begin a little bit earlier, but also need to include this component. What does the church teach about same-sex attraction? If you're feeling same-sex attractions yourself, what does this mean about you and for you? Do you have any advice to Catholic school curriculum editors or principals about a good, healthy, compassionate way to introduce this topic to younger kids? How do we talk about this in schools? Elementary schools I'm talking about.
So I remember hearing Matt Fradd give a talk one time, and he writes extensively about pornography. Right. And one of the questions was, what do I do with my 5-year-old or 6-year-old? I don't want them to go looking for it because I told them to, right? Or because I mentioned it, not that you told them to. And he said, well, when his kids get old enough, to understand the difference between, parts that are covered by a bathing suit and parts that are not, good, right. Private parts of your body and parts that, what they do is he and his wife sit their kids down and say, this is what God is asking us to do, to respect one another and respect one another's privacy. Not everybody will do that all the time. And sometimes people might say things or do things or show you things that make you feel scared or uncomfortable or give you lots of questions. You just kind of sometimes you get that worried feeling in your tummy. We want you to know, if that ever happens, we will be very, very, very happy if you come and tell us about it. We're never going to be angry at you. We're never going to yell. We're never going to get anybody in trouble. If you see anything or hear anything that makes you worried or scared, please always come right to us and tell us about it. And we will always be happy that you did that. Right. So I think that's a really good way to prepare them for that, if whatever they might experience. And then if they've seen it, well, then you have a follow-up conversation about why people do that or why people look at that, what it means. And so I think that leads to a bigger reality, which is before kids go to school, we need to have conversations about safety and privacy and dignity and intimacy in the family, right? So your question is specifically about school, but if it's not being supported or even mentioned in the home, then you do have all the good ideas that you want, and it's going to fall flat.
Right.
But I think in terms of school, one question is, how do you get the message across about the difference between male and female and God's plan for complementarity and God's plan for sexuality, when what they are seeing on television or hearing from others, or maybe is actually happening in their own family, is contradicting that, right? How do you convey that without making children feel ashamed of their families, right? And I think it's important to be able to explain it in a way that says, this is God's plan. This is how God makes all of us, either as boys or as girls, and when we grow up and it's time to form a family, it's a boy and a girl, a mommy and a daddy that do that. And not everybody understands that or chooses that, and we don't hate people that do that, but we have to understand this is God's plan, right? A mom that I trust, pointed out one time, she said, little children see things in black and white. There are good people and there are bad people, right? So does God want us to do these things? No. Well, does that mean Uncle so-and-so is a bad person? No, but he's doing something that God doesn't want us to do. And so we pray for that he'll understand better what God wants us to do, right? So I think, and this is true not just for children, but for anybody, we teach best about things that depart from God's plan by starting with an enthusiastic, cheerful, full appreciation for God's plan. It's so good that men and women can give their lives to each other. It's so good that when they love one another, they can create new life. It's so good that God calls them to be together till they die. Like, to really appreciate that, and you can start that at any age, right? Without having to get into the mechanics of sexual intimacy. And then to, when people say, well, some people get divorced or some people, are with the same sex or whatever, they've got a foundation to understand, yes, that's a sin because this thing that God creates is so good that he doesn't want us ever to miss the goodness of it. And so when people do this, they're missing something important. I think another thing is because children see things in black and white, this idea that asking little children what their sexual orientation is, or saying, well, some boys, some people who look like boys are boys, and some people that look like boys are girls. Like, all that does to an elementary school person is scare the wits out of them, because
and confuse them.
Yeah, I thought there were boys and there were girls.
Right.
So now anybody can be anything. Well, how do I know?
Right.
How do I know who I am, or how do I find out? And that's just, it can be very traumatizing on its own.
And it's traumatizing to parents when, you're at the pediatrician, and for your minor child, a young child, you're asked, your child is asked to check off boxes. Are you a boy who is attracted to a boy? Are you a girl who's attracted to a, and they're not even thinking of those kind of things. Can you just take my child's temperature and give us the antibiotics so we can go home? I don't understand why. And I have talked to many of my friends and peers and other parents who have experienced similar things. And sometimes now the new thing is to ask the parent to leave the room so that the doctor can speak to them alone, which I think is such a violation of parents' rights. But there's so many different ways in which, this idea of same-sex attraction being just extremely, it's part of everyone's life, and it's a huge part of the population, and it's just so mainstreamed, and it comes at you from every direction. There's almost no place you can't deal with it as a parent. And again, not at the high school level anymore. You really have to kind of talk to kids at a level when I think they're not developmentally capable of even sort of comprehending what you're saying.
Yeah, and I think, when that happens in terms of same-sex attraction or transgender questions, or when it happens in the month of June, it gets our attention. But we'd be foolish to think that that our bad teaching about sexuality is only or even primarily about homosexuality, right? I mean, we know, sex. There's opposite sex intimacy in movies and TV all over the place, and in music, and even in the way that, as I said, if what's being taught in school is not being reinforced in the home, well, then it just leaves kids questioning whether it's even important. So, always the best way to teach is to live authentically oneself, right? And so I just wouldn't want us to put such a laser beam focus on the LGBT lobby or drag queen story hour, things like that we lose the bigger picture, which is that as a culture, we generally are pretty messed up in terms of how
human sexuality overall.
Human sexuality in general, yeah.
I just want to mention this to our listeners. If you are enjoying this episode, if you feel edified by our conversations, then please share it directly with a friend. If you're talking with someone after Mass or you're at a coffee shop and this particular topic comes up, please tell them about this podcast and help build them up too.
Well, let's kind of shift from kids then to parents. And if you have, a couple in your parish come to you and they have a child who has just come out to them as gay or lesbian, how would you counsel them? And the parents are obviously very upset. And like you said, they come out of the closet, the parents want to go in. That's a good analogy. How would you counsel them to interact with their child who has shared this with them?
Of course, it's going to depend on the age of the son or daughter that we're talking about, right? I think more of the time, by the time I'm seeing them, their son or daughter is college age or older, right? And but no matter what the age of the child, the first advice is don't panic, right? I think people can come with a kind of an emergency room mentality. Something's wrong, I have to fix it. What's the right resource? What's the right website? What's the right film or lecture or homily to give them so that they'll see what I see, right? No, that's wrong, right?
Okay.
Because
that's very helpful, because that's not that wouldn't be my instinct.
Sure.
Yeah.
But I think one thing we have to keep in mind is by the time a son or daughter shares this with a parent, they've been thinking about it for a really long time. And the parent, it's natural to, be startled by that and panic. But, if they were open to a church resource in that initial moment, they would have found it already. Because they've been dealing with these questions in themselves for a long time. Right. In that moment, I think what's really important is to send a message, mostly by listening more than speaking, right? To send a message that my love for you hasn't changed just because I know something that I didn't know before. In fact, my love for you can only grow the more that you share yourself with me in an honest way. Right? Because like any relationship, but certainly with parents, it's not as much what people say or do as how the person to whom they're speaking interprets or experiences it, right? It's a matter of perception, right? I'm the oldest of 6 children in 7 years. And, by the time my sister was a teenager, I was in the seminary. And sometimes we talk about her experience in those years, and it's like, did we grow up in the same house with the same people? And it's not that my parents were all that different for her or for me. It's just that we experienced it differently, we perceived it differently. And I think if a parent is, their reaction is, well, this is a phase that you're going through, or, let me remind you what the church says, and then you'll see it differently, or, you really need to figure something out here. Even when they say with all good intentions, well, how can I help you to, get past this, or what did I do that makes you feel this way? The message that a son or daughter perceives most of the time is, your love for me is contingent on me figuring this out, right? On this not being part of my life. I think not accidentally, all of us are susceptible to thinking that God feels like that too. I've just been absolved in confession, and that's why God loves me. Now I've messed up, and I have to figure this out before I can turn back to the Lord, right? So, St. Paul says, every family, all fatherhood on earth takes its name from God the Father, right? Then we in that moment, the key is patience, listening, keeping one's own reactions, emotional reactions, for a later conversation with one's spouse, or with a spiritual director, or with an encouraged chapter. But really saying, thank you for letting me know, because I didn't know this before. Because I know it, I want to know more. And whenever you're ready to talk, I'm ready to listen. Knowing this doesn't change my love for you. It also doesn't change the way I look at you. I still have the same desires and expectations for you. But it's your experience, not my experience. So if I'm going to understand and be able to be there for you, I need you to share more of your story with me, right? And really try to take that in. And then moving forward, to affirm everything that it's possible to affirm, right? I don't think it's automatically condoning bad decisions to say, I can see that this person is important to you. Of course they can come on Christmas Day, because, our doors are open to family and friends, and, but I don't think that you being in an intimate relationship with them is the right thing. So if you want free room and board, these are the expectations that I have.
Well, you would say the same thing if
Hopefully.
there was a heterosexual couple. You're not going to share a bedroom when you're here for the holidays.
But how many people we might run into who don't have the same expectations or boundaries for children who are involved with someone of the opposite sex. I mean, if a parent.
Well, my mother wouldn't have.
Well, fair enough. I mean, but it's this generation.
Not that my experience is normative for everyone else, but
no, for sure, sure. But to be able to acknowledge this person is a good person, and if we were talking about a friendship, I'd be all for it. I just don't think where you're looking for your happiness is where God has put it or intends you to find it. And then with, some people jump right to the end and, well, what if they get married and what do I say? Or what if they, what if they want to adopt children, or what do I do? And I think in cases like that, first of all, we don't need to figure out the next 5-10 years in one moment, right? But, when it comes to that, to say, look, I love you as much as I ever have. I respect this person as a human being. I don't think, what you're intending to do is going to be good for you, but I also don't expect you to change what you think your conscience is telling you to do so that I can love you, right? All I'm asking in return is that you don't ask me to say or do something that would go against my conscience so that you can believe that I love you, right?
That's really helpful, Father, that a parent then can assert themselves and say, but that I have a conscience too, and that God is expecting me to respect. And so if the only way I can get your love and approval is to approve of what you're doing, then you're asking me to do something I can't do.
Right, exactly. And so that mutuality of respect, right? I mean, every young person has to go through that process of transitioning from a child to adult relationship to a relationship of adults who are not peers and not necessarily equals, but have to relate to each other as adults, right? So, just because your sexual attractions are heading in this direction doesn't mean that, you have carte blanche to treat me poorly or to disregard the fact that we are a family and we owe each other some obligations, or,
Right.
if you want me to respect your maturity and the fact that you can make decisions like a grown up, well, that has to be reciprocal, right?
Right.
And so, if you're asking me what I think and I tell you the truth, well, you're much too old to just kind of throw up your hands and yell, "You hate me," and run out the door,
Right.
But that takes maturation on both sides of the equation,
Right.
but that's for everybody. That doesn't have anything to do with experiencing same-sex attraction. It just has to do with growing up.
Right. Well, there was something that Cardinal George said at one point when, asked about this particular issue, where he talked about sort of the culture's obsession, I believe is the word he used, with love having to be expressed genitally in order for it to be love. Can you talk about the other different types of loves that the church would say are there and are present and are real forms of love, but don't necessarily need to be expressed in this manner?
For sure, and I think that is really the church's desire for that integration we're talking about with chastity, right? That we understand that the purpose of physically intimate expressions of love are to make and build one up as a family, right? And so the context for a sexual expression of love is a permanent, faithful relationship between a man and a woman whose sexual relations are open to having children. Because it's in that context that sex can be something that brings someone out of oneself towards the other, right? And understanding that, and understanding erotic love in that particular context, gives someone the perspective to say, well, if I'm feeling erotic desires, sexual desires, towards a person who's not my spouse and can't be my spouse, it doesn't make me a bad person, but it's not something I can do to follow that desire, because I can only be in a sexually intimate relationship with someone who is my spouse.
Right.
But when we understand and appreciate that, it makes a person more free to live other kinds of love, like affection, friendship, charity, the divine love that God has for us and allows us to love Him and love the people that He loves. And really, all of those loves become more authentic, richer, more free, because we keep each in its proper sphere, and because erotic desire is kept for a situation where I'm pursuing someone towards marriage, or they're already my spouse. And if they can't ever be my spouse, for various reasons, they're married to someone else, or I made a commitment, or they're the same sex, or whatever, then what I need to do is offer. I don't have to be afraid of my own heart or act as if it's a bad thing to feel things, but I surrender that to the Lord, following His plan. But then He gives me the opportunity to be involved in different kinds of love.
Right. So not all love is love. I mean, and that's, to reduce marriage, or to reduce, a true friendship that's not a sexual friendship, to a catchphrase, to 3 words, it just cheapens it.
I made a public promise of celibacy almost 25 years ago when I was ordained a deacon. I have lots of love in my life. I don't have a sexual partner, but I love my family, and my family loves me. I love my friends, and my friends love me. I love my parishioners, and most of my parishioners love me. But the world will teach us that all strong feelings must be sexual feelings, and the only real relationships are sexual relationships. And that it's an insult to every human heart, right? And so when people want to convince the church, or people in the church, that calling anybody to chastity, by which they mean abstinence and celibacy, is somehow condemning someone to a life without love. It's just not giving people the credit to be able to love with a whole heart, and to find fulfillment and love in friendship, in spiritual fatherhood, spiritual motherhood, in commitments, in all sorts of service, and especially in an intimate prayer life with the Lord.
Just a note for our listeners, we also recorded a short animated video with today's guest. It's a great supplement to this conversation. We'll link to that in the show notes so that you can go and see it for yourself.
Just as we close up here, I didn't want to focus too much on this during our conversation, but there are some opposing voices in the church,
No doubt,
who would, I think, probably very much take issue with some of the things that you've said here today. Probably the best known among them would be Jesuit Father James Martin, who has a very, very public persona. He's very active on social media. He's met twice now, I think, with the Holy Father. And how do you respond, you just as a fellow Catholic priest, to the ministry that I believe he's trying to conduct to people who feel very wounded and very excluded from the church, which I suppose is a very genuine and good thing, but yet he is sowing a lot of confusion and actually disinformation about what you've just stated in such a beautiful, comprehensive way, what the church really feels, and the love that it has for people who are experiencing these same-sex attractions. How do you find in your own ministry as a priest, it is dealing with this it's not just a competing voice, but it's a very loud and significant competing voice, almost drowning out yours exclusively?
I think, well, you're right. I mean, people like Father Martin, he has a very big social media platform, and he was building that by doing really good work, writing good books on spirituality and the saints.
And on the saints
for
and
a
prayer,
long time.
yes.
And, he's certainly not the only voice in the church who today would say, would perceive the church's teaching about homosexuality to be outdated or to not be attentive to people's desires and needs. But I think whenever taking the discussion in that direction comes from a priest or a bishop or a cardinal, it's much more distressing, right? And much more dangerous, frankly. Back in April, I took the opportunity to publish an open letter to Cardinal Jean-Claude Hollerich, who's the Archbishop of Luxembourg and the Relator General for the Synod. So he'll write the final report next year when the Synod of Bishops meets. And Cardinal Reinhard Marx, who's the Archbishop of Munich and one of the Holy Father's closest advisors. In February, Cardinal Hollerich had said that the social scientific basis for the Church's teaching was no longer correct and that the Church needed to review and revise its doctrine. And in March, Cardinal Marx had said that the Catechism is not written in stone and we may doubt what it says. Now, they know the teaching probably better than I do. Father Martin, any number of priests who are commenting, they all know the teachings, right? So in my letter, I didn't really have to argue or defend the teaching. But what I pointed out was that the way that the Catechism phrases its doctrinal definition about homosexual acts, we were talking before about person, inclination, and action, right? That teaching where it says that these actions are intrinsically disordered, meaning that by their nature, intrinsically, sexual acts between people of the same sex are missing complementarity, procreativity, part of the ordering of sexuality. That's all that phrase means. It's not meant to be hurtful. But that teaching is presented in the Catechism with the words, basing itself on sacred scripture. Tradition has always declared that homosexual acts are intrinsically disordered. The Church uses those phrases when it talks about the charism of infallibility. And my belief is that the Catechism, by phrasing it that way, is pointing out that teaching is an infallible teaching of the ordinary universal magisterium, meaning it can't change. And so in my letter, I said to the two cardinals, I said, when we and every deacon, priest, and bishop is ordained, we take an oath of fidelity and say that we promise, we swear to God that in regard to that level of teaching, we will faithfully adhere to it, we will avoid contrary doctrines, and we will teach others to believe it. And so, what I said to them was, well, first of all, you're hurting the people that you want to help, because when you suggest or say outright that this teaching can change or should change or must change, you're raising false hopes. And when the Church has to come back, and Pope Francis has done this on a number of occasions, and reiterate the clear teaching of the Church, then people feel betrayed and let down and like they weren't listened to, because someone in authority said that a teaching could change, which by its nature could never have changed. They're also hurting people I'm trying to help, because our members who are living this life at a great personal sacrifice feel that the bishops and cardinals closest to the center of the church don't respect their sacrifice. They're hurting the church in the eyes of the world, because at the very least, we look disunified, and the Lord's prayer for us, what was on his mind as he was heading to the cross? That we would all be one, right? And they give scandal to the faithful and to the rest of the world about, well, what does the church really believe?
Right.
How does the church really work? And frankly, they may be doing harm to their own salvation, because, we took an oath, and to break an oath is perjury.
And they know better.
And perjury is a mortal sin.
Yeah.
And when you persist in a mortal sin till your death, then you put your salvation in jeopardy.
Yeah.
So what I was asking them, and what I would ask any member of the clergy, is be faithful to your oath. Recognize this teaching as something important, dogmatic, that can't change, that's written not just in the scripture and the teaching of the church, but in the very nature of our sexed bodies that only exist as male or female.
Right.
Be faithful to your oath. That's going to help the church to get to a place where we're not afraid of the teaching, and we see it's our responsibility to proclaim it more often, more clearly, not just in terms of homosexuality, but in terms of sexuality in general,
across the
and the
board.
nature of the human person, and the nature of marriage, and of life in the womb, and the dignity of life. These things are all part of the same plan, the same thread. And if we are, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith said that departure from the church's teaching or silence about it deprives homosexual men and women of the pastoral care that they need and deserve. And so to soft pedal it, or stay silent and say this is up to each person's conscience, in an effort not to offend, is a disservice.
Right, and such a harm to that person and that person's soul.
Especially coming from the clergy. Every once in a while, I'll tell someone in confession or spiritual direction that they're being too scrupulous, or that they're seeing the moral teaching wrong, and they start to look at me like, oh, maybe he's just telling me what I want to hear to make me feel better. And at that point, I stop and I said, listen, when you die and go and stand before the Lord, you have to answer for all of your choices. When I die as a priest and go and stand before the Lord, I have to answer for everything that I've said and did, but I also have to answer for all the counsel and advice I give to everybody else.
Right.
And I like you a lot, but I'm not going. I'm not going to hell.
I don't like you that much.
I'm not going to hell to make you feel better.
Right.
And so, it's incumbent on us as clergy and as leaders in the church to really consider, are we being faithful to the promises that we've made? Are we being faithful to what the church actually says? And are we helping people to embrace it and to find the freedom and the joy that comes from a chaste life? That
letter that you wrote, the open letters, I suppose by its very definition, an open letter is open. It can be read. Where could our listeners find it to read it?
So it's online in 11 languages.
Oh, marvelous. Okay.
It kind of took off. They can look at Catholic News Agency. They can just Google Bochanski and open letter, and they'll find it. Okay, terrific. And in order to find courage or encourage, where would our listeners go? So our main website for our members and for people who want to support them is Courage RC for Roman Catholic, couragerc.org. Okay. We also, starting in 2015, have a website that's more of a resource library for educators, for clergy, for people in the healing professions, called truthandlove.com. We write all those words written out, truthandlove.com. And on the question of gender, and also these broader questions of sexuality and how to teach children, I have to promote the website of some friends of ours, personandidentity.com, which is a huge project of the Catholic Women's Forum. And if you can't find it there, it's not important. Right? It's not worth finding. Mary Rice Hassan and Dr. Teresa Farnan have done a terrific job. Absolutely. Incredible amount of time and really curating the very best articles and resources that the church has to offer on this. So, well, Father Philip Bochanski, what a wonderful conversation we've had. It was a joy to have you here at the EDIFY studio, and God bless you and all the work that you're doing. Thanks so much.
Thank you for listening. To make it easier for you to listen to future EDIFY podcast episodes, please make sure you subscribe over at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Thank you.